Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about great books. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And today we are talking about Julius Caesar, and we're doing it with a very special guest.
Yes, we're doing it with Heidi White. Heidi is a teacher, editor, podcaster, and author. She's a co-host of the Close Reads podcast and author of the forthcoming book, The Divided Soul, Reuniting Duty and Desire in Literature and Life. That's going to be good. She serves on the board of directors of the Anselm Society in Colorado Springs and the academic advisory board for the Classical Learning Test. She's also an avid lover of Shakespeare and a good friend. Heidi, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. How are you guys doing?
I'm excited. I can't wait to get to talk about some Shakespeare.
Very excited. I think this is our first. No, we did Macbeth back in the day. So this is our second Shakespeare.
Wow. I'm so excited.
It's so hard to, either do enough Shakespeare or keep from doing Shakespeare all the time, right? There's a tendency to just fall into one of those extremes. And this will be interesting, too, because I think the next text we have up is Marlowe. So we're going to be hanging out in Renaissance drama for a while.
Oh, wow. A perfect combination.
Yeah. So I think the first thing, I'll kick us off here. I want to start with a story about the first time I read Julius Caesar, because this was the first Shakespeare play I ever read.
Really?
Same.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a classic first Shakespeare play for a young child in public school. That's a joke. Yes. What happened was, I was in seventh grade, and my teacher, my English teacher, she brought in boxes of books, and she covered several long tables with all these books from her own collection. And the assignment was you could pick any book off the table, and you had to read it and write a book report about it. And I think we maybe had to do 2 or 3 of them over the course of the semester. And so I'm going down this book, and there's all kinds of stuff that I'm not interested in. And then I found this book, and I knew about Julius Caesar because we covered him in history. I had actually seen the old Rex Harrison Cleopatra movie, which I was really not old enough to have seen, but I saw it. And actually it was shown in my history class after I saw it as well. So, and I was a big Caesar guy, right? Everyone's like, oh, we hate Caesar. I'm like, I love Caesar. Caesar's great. And so I saw this book, and I was like, I've got to read it. So I took it up to check it out from her, and she goes, oh no, I didn't mean to put that in there. You don't want to read that. That's too old for you. And I was like, lady, you told me to pick a book. I picked a book. I'm reading this book. And she's like, no, she couldn't convince me. So she says, okay, fine. But if it gets to be too much, just bring it back and you can trade it out for something else. Well, at that point, there's no way I'm bringing it back, right? I mean, stubbornness kicks in. So it's one of those old editions where you had the facing page where it glossed all the difficult words. And I started reading it, and pretty much right off the bat, I thought, this is amazing. I fell in love with the language. I devoured it. I remember we went to visit my great aunt in another city, and I took it with me, and I got in trouble because I was reading it instead of talking to my relatives. I started speaking in Shakespearean English, and I got in trouble at school for that. And they told me to stop speaking in Shakespearean English because it was inappropriate for school. And I've loved Shakespeare ever since.
Wow. That's a great story.
That's fantastic.
This is for me going back to where it all started. I mean, that was
back
really,
to your roots.
Not even my first Shakespeare. I think about it, it's really my first great text of the tradition. So I mean, yeah, this is ground zero for me.
This is really exciting.
I'm going to read that as your teacher was just doing a total reverse psychology move on you. Like she knew you were going to enjoy it.
I really want that to be true.
I do as well. Since we don't know any better, let's assume that's the case. So the first thing that struck me as a young reader reading this, and that strikes me again on this reading of it now as a less young reader, is that Caesar is in the play surprisingly little, given that it's called Julius Caesar. Right? He doesn't have very many lines. It wouldn't be a great role to have if you were auditioning and you're thinking, I'm going to be a big star. I'm going to audition for Caesar. Don't do that, guys. It's a trap. That's not the role you want. You want Brutus maybe, or Cassius or someone like that. And I think I'll just throw that to you first for you guys to comment on before I say why. If I say why I think that is.
So
you guys notice that too?
Yes, for sure. And Shakespeare's relatively well known for this. His history plays tend to have as the title the name of the ruler on the throne, and the intrigue that takes place amongst the characters who are looking to the ruler is the real action of the play, the real conflict of the play. And that's certainly the case in this one.
Do you think that's a bit subversive on his part? I mean, he's living under Elizabeth I. not real up on his politics, but it does seem that one could take away from that the conclusion that what matters more is not who's on the throne, but everything else that's happening around them.
Absolutely. I think that that's a safe bet. Is it subversive? You know what you just said about Shakespeare's politics. Nobody really knows his politics. Nobody really knows his religion, right? He has this really fantastic tendency to create these conflicts without taking a side on them, which is remarkable, right? So you have just, when I teach Shakespeare, especially the history plays, which are my favorite, he presents these issues, these big, important human issues, right? Love and death and power, authority, these kinds of questions. He throws them in the middle of the ring, and then he presents characters that represent points and counterpoints to each side, right? So we've got Brutus on one side, then we've got Cassius over here, and we've got Mark Antony over here, and they are the ones playing out the drama on the stage, and Shakespeare himself is very, he's not present in that. And there's that great story about Elizabeth I when she was watching Richard II perform before her, and she stands up and storms out of the Globe Theater and says, "Know ye not, I am Richard." Right? Because the play is about a monarch who's deposed. And this was her fear, right? This fear of succession, of being intrigued against. And so Shakespeare surely knew that and put his modern contemporary politics into the plays, hidden beneath all of the intrigue that's taking place on stage.
For God's sake, let us sit on the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings.
Yes.
It is interesting, though. I think, Caesar in many ways haunts the play. He's literally at times, but he's an ever-present force, even when he's not actually on stage. So my reading of that was that his greatness becomes a sort of mirror into which the other characters find themselves. So in many ways, Caesar's sort of the middle term that relates the various characters to each other. And in that way, I found it to be, this read, I had not noticed that the couple times I've read it before. I just found that to be a really interesting feature of it. Like, he's not on screen or he's not on stage, but he's still moving the action, which maybe is a testimony to how great he is.
I think that's right. And that's a reason I think why, what Heidi was talking about, Shakespeare's shiftiness, right? You can't point to anything in the play and then point to Shakespeare and say, look what he's doing, arrest him. Which is a survival trait. Elizabeth I brings stability after a period of massive instability. It's very important. But I think also part of what we're seeing there, and as far as this goes, is this sense of, look, this is in the same way that we talk about the Victorian era or the Edwardian era, right? All these things that happen during a monarch's reign, they become attached to the monarch. And in a turn of phrase that Shakespeare is fond of using across his plays, the monarch can refer to themselves with the name of the country. We are England, speaking of himself, right? And so I think you get that same sense here. Caesar flavors everything that's happening here. And every character in this play is obsessed with Caesar, some positively and some negatively. And that's kind of their problem, is they're all trying to figure out who they are. And really, you kind of have to follow this all the way through to Antony and Cleopatra, because that doesn't really end with the action of the play here. Mark Antony is still trying to figure out, Octavius is still trying to figure out who he is as the next Caesar, even after the action of this play concludes.
Right.
What is it about Caesar that's so great?
Caesar is, this reminds me of, Socrates' very famous principle that the city is like the soul, right? That Caesar is representative of Rome, but Rome is changing. Rome is dividing against itself. The old order has fallen away, but the new order has not yet begun. So Caesar both catalyzes and represents this kind of liminal stage in the life of Rome, and the vacuum that's created at his assassination opens up Rome, the possibilities of Rome, What could Rome be, right? And what is it like? And also looking backwards, then what is it that has led to this? The Roman Republic was idolized by its own people. They were so proud of it. And I just think of Augustine saying that Rome was plagued by the noble vices, the splendid vices, right? That look like virtues to the outside, but within are truly the worst of vices.
Yeah.
And their pride, their vainglory, right? And so that's what's taking place on the political level. But then also within the soul, we have this amazing kind of allegory of rulership of the inner self as well, and who gets to decide what a person, what the life of an individual and the life of a city should be, and that of course is honed in on Brutus, right? Who is a noble man, right? But is he really? And I think that's really the main question of the play, is less about Caesar and more about Brutus. But Caesar, to your point, Wesley, he's the magnet of that. He's the representative of it. He's the dividing line of both the city and the soul.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's important to remember, and Shakespeare knows his history. This comes it's been a terrible couple of centuries for Rome. And let's say the last century has been pretty bad. They've had a couple of slave rebellions, and they've had a civil war before Caesar's civil war with Pompey, which he's just finished. And Pompey was the incumbent. Pompey was in Rome and popular with everyone, and he was the people's choice and whatnot. And Caesar was off in Gaul with the legions when all that broke out. And he sort of comes back as the invader, and he comes out on top of all of that. And when he comes out on top of it, man, it's just like he hung the moon, and everyone's all in favor of him. But there's this large contingent of folks in the Senate who kind of gone all in on Pompey, and so they're concerned about what's going to happen to them in general. But also, there's just been an enormous amount of warfare here, and the people are ready to look for somebody who can bring stability to Rome. And I think what's key about all of that is that in that moment in their history, they become more interested in safety than they were in the Republic. And so they're primed for a change. They're ready for a change. And however much Brutus and Cassius and company may have struck a blow in favor of the Republic was already dead. And this is the end of it. I mean, we see it, the triumvirate is not the Republic, and then the empire begins after that. And so this is, the last gasp of men who are looking backwards on these glory days, and especially for Brutus, Marcus Junius Brutus, by the way, whose ancestors killed Tarquin, the last of the Roman kings, and founded the Republic. And so Brutus he especially has got a responsibility in his own mind and in the minds of the other senators to safeguard the Republic, right? And so, is he a nobleman, and is he up to the task? Because he makes a pretty significant oversight in the way he carries through this whole project of removing Caesar and setting up a stabler Rome, and that's Mark Antony.
Right. Well, and that question is intriguing to me. Brutus is, does he steal the show? I don't know. There's so many compelling characters in this play, but he is the main character. And I think everything you're saying on the political stage, what I love about Shakespeare so much is that he never lets a play remain political, right? He always makes it human. He always brings it down to the psychological level as well as the political level. And this play to me is so compelling in that way, because I look at Brutus and, opinion is divided on him, as it should be, because he's ambiguous. But if he was trying to be an honorable man, that's interesting to me, right? Yeah. But what's even more interesting to me is if he does have an ulterior motive. Because how many times do we tell ourselves a story of how we're doing something that we have to do, right? Air quotes, right? I have to do this for the greater good. But if it serves me, how do you know? How do you know where virtue ends and vice begins? And I think that is so concentrated on Brutus in this play, when you can look around at many of the other characters who have these Machiavellian characteristics. You can easily see how self-serving they are. Cassius is a great example of that. But Brutus remains ambiguous throughout the whole play and seems deeply bewildered by the moral conflicts that are raised by the surrounding political situation.
Yeah. Yeah. But that might be a good inroad into something that Father Wesley, I know you were concerned to talk about friendship in this play. Could you lead us into that a little bit?
Yeah, so we did Nicomachean and Ethics last, and we were talking about what it means to be a good friend and how sometimes a good friend has to do things that are unpleasant for the good of the other person in the friendship. And one line that Junius said that stuck out to me because my son and I were reading The Hobbit out loud was that sometimes you have to be like Bilbo taking the Arkenstone from Thorin to be a good friend. And I definitely think that's true. This is kind of the attitude that Brutus presents for himself, that he loves Caesar, and the only problem is that Caesar has developed this vice of ambition that is a problem, and so he has to cut him down. But it's better that he cut him down now than kind of let him fall into this. And so the question is Brutus actually being a friend here or not? And I mean, I think Heidi's point about ulterior motives definitely came up to me more in this read than it has previously. I think Mark Antony's speech does a good job of drawing out the potential ulterior motives there. But it is an interesting question, especially in light of our previous discussion about friendship.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add on to that, I mean, it's one of the passages we talked about in Nicomachean Ethics, of course, is when Aristotle asked the question, would a friend want a friend to become a god?
Right.
And there's this, it's very complicated, very strange passage where the logic seems to be going in the direction of, you want the best thing for the friend. And so you're thinking Aristotle is going to conclude, therefore you would want the friend to become a god. But he concludes, therefore, as a friend, I should want my friend to remain as he is. Right.
And you do see them wrestling with this, I think, fairly explicitly in the play, because you've got the part where Cassius talks about when he had to rescue Caesar from drowning.
That's right.
And then right before they kill him, Caesar goes on that rant about how he'll never change. He's everyone else might change, but he's the sturdiest and impassable, figure. And so there is kind of a development in Caesar that might not be for the best.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so to me, there's this feeling of, so Aristotle seems to be on Brutus's side, that if you see your friend going, Caesar's on the way to becoming something no Roman ought to become, an absolute ruler, a tyrant in the non-pejorative sense of the word. Because that's against the spirit of the Republic and the spirit of Roman citizenship and all of that. And so from Aristotle, from Nicomachean Ethics, Brutus has got a good argument that it would be his duty as a friend to shut his friend down. He's also got the argument again from Augustine, which of course Brutus doesn't know is Augustine, but he's got that argument Heidi brought up earlier. Ambition is one of these splendid vices, right? And so it looks like great things are coming for Caesar, but they're going to destroy what's most important about Caesar. It's so better to cut him off. And it's almost like this principled application of what Gregory of Nazianzus says about death, that death is a mercy because it puts an end to our ability to sin and store up wrath for ourselves.
And Brutus makes that point, that it's better if the longer you live, the longer you fear death.
Yeah, that's right.
It is hard to make a case that the way that you best love your friend is to stab him to death.
Right.
Repeatedly.
Right. I think his stronger argument is it's the best thing for Rome. That's much stronger. But I think Brutus believes that he truly loves his friend. And he is pitted at the beginning of the play. Shakespeare does such a masterful job in a literary sense through his conversation with Cassius, so that we can see how Brutus is being manipulated by Cassius, who is a Machiavellian, self-serving character. And Brutus's responses seem to indicate that he is not, at least at that point. But his reaction's so extreme that it every time I read it makes me wonder, where does his personal ambition, where does it begin, right? At what point is it ignited, even hidden from himself? If that's the case, or else he is, as Mark Antony so sarcastically says, an honorable man, right? I think that's what's really interesting about the play and why Brutus is so compelling on stage, and why he is the focal point, because he is being bandied about by the characters on stage who know exactly what they're doing. And he's unique in Shakespeare's canon in the sense that he is so easily, he's a protagonist who's easily manipulated, right? And he changes his mind often. And that is, so he's a very tragic character, I think, in the play.
Yeah. And he changes his mind quickly.
Yes.
Because I almost wanted another scene between that first scene when Cassius is broaching the idea to him and the scene at his house when he seems to be engaged, right? I mean, it was a pretty quick switch. I do think that's meant to speak to the depth of his love for Rome, that his love of Caesar, whatever the duties of his love to Caesar might be, they would have to see to his love for Rome. I think that's clear there. But yeah, it does feel, it's very hard not to make that feel like a swing, that you think, gosh, Cassius didn't have to push you that hard to get you to, I have to murder my friend, you know?
Right. Why does he make the switch so easily? It has to be, but what is it truly because he thinks he's doing the right thing, right? And that's where Shakespeare shines as a masterful author. Like, he gives us this character who's completely believable. I don't think that Brutus fails as a literary character. I think he's completely believable in his changeableness. But that quick shift does raise the question, why? Like, what is it? Is it truly love for Rome? Which you can make the case that it was, because, to your point, the Roman virtues were pietas, right? Piety, civic piety, Rome first above all. There's so many stories. They were overflowing with stories about how Rome elevated family betrayal, right? This mother threw her son under the bus, Volumnia is telling Coriolanus not even to bother coming back, like that. The whole Roman ethos is Rome first at the cost of everything. And so you can make a compelling case throughout this entire play that is supported by the text that Brutus was a completely honorable man according to Roman virtue. Or you can let him be a little bit more gray.
Well, what's great about that is, so that does bring the Republic onto the table, because essentially what you're describing is the stories that have been told to the guardians of the city to form them have been the stories that would cause them to sacrifice for the city over self. And then you say, yes, it's quite possible Brutus is an honorable man. And of course, that's the hilarious refrain that Mark Antony keeps using in his funeral speech. He says it, I counted 8 or 9 times. I don't say, but Brutus is an honorable man. But Brutus is an honorable man, right? He's exactly what you would expect from years of government training in Rome. And then there's this bit that Cassius says to him, one of the most famous lines in the play, from Act 1, Scene 2, men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. Right? Which, if we are underlings, it's not because some sort of cosmic destiny has forced us into this position. It's because we don't seize those moments when we could be the masters of our fates to make something more of ourselves. This is Cassius setting Brutus on, and so it's automatically suspect. But there is this sense of, I think what I'm being made to think of by the points you guys are raising is, how free is Brutus given the narrative that he's been raised in? The way he's been taught to look at this, the lens he has to see things through. Is this kind of a necessary conclusion for him when the syllogism comes into this form?
Right.
And I think you're right. I mean, I love what Heidi's saying about Brutus's ambiguity. I think it's a very good goal not to resolve Brutus's ambiguity, because I think we all know that ambiguity in our own souls as well. When we look at the important decisions in our life, or the difficult decisions, or whatever, that we hope we're doing it for the right reason. I think the reality is probably that even when we do it for the right reason, we also do it for the wrong reason. And so that ambiguity is something that's deeply human in a fallen world.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Can we talk about the plebes for a second?
Please.
I love them. So this time around, and I never had this thought before, but I suddenly realized what it is the plebes have been reminding me of all this time. So the plebes are the normal people in Rome, and so there's all these random people who come up. They're the guys who they kill the poet because he's got the wrong name. They get the wrong guy, which is hilarious because in Rome they've only got like 20 first names anyway, and so that would be a common sort of thing. And they're like, oh, we love Caesar. No, we hate Caesar. No, we love Caesar. Back and forth and back and forth. And of course, there's this brilliant. Lots has been done and written about the way an orator can play a crowd, from the scene of how Brutus gives his funeral oration, and they're all for it. And then Antony comes back and has them ready to. He's got to hold them back so he can finish whipping them up into a furor before they go. And I finally figured out what it is that these guys in the play remind me of.
Go on.
It's the Duffelpuds in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Right, the guys who are constantly everything the chief says, like, that's right, chief, you said it, chief, couldn't have said it better. And then Lucy says something and they agree with Lucy just as much.
There it is. Great. I love it. That's perfect. Now I'm just always going to picture little Duffelpuds hopping around the Roman forum.
It's hilarious because there's so much subtlety. Usually, we're talking about how subtle Shakespeare is in his plays and whatever. He's chosen not to be subtle with the plebes at all. I mean, he hits you over the head with their fickleness. Yeah,
that's true. And I think that's super important to the play. And is how easily influenced Rome is by their leaders. And that's how Caesar has risen to power. Yeah. Right. And it is unclear in the play how ambitious Caesar is, and it has to be unclear in the play how ambitious Caesar is. I mean, we're told by Cassius, 3 times I offer them the crown and the Lupercal, and he 3 times he refused it, right? And that's a historical fact. But at the same time, he crossed the Rubicon, right? Caesar is enduringly ambiguous to us. We don't know what to make of him. So the people then are these pawns that are played out, and all of the speech makers, all of the rhetoricians, right? They are making claims for the good of Rome. But the plebeians, they don't really get a say. They end up being pawns. And I just see so much of Machiavelli written all over. Like, Shakespeare keeps putting these, which of course was an anachronism to the Romans, but not to Shakespeare.
That's right.
So Shakespeare puts the manipulation of the masses in the hands of his powerful people all the time. And if you are a playwright, how do you give them power? You give them power with words, right? And so that's why we have these remarkable speeches. I mean, Mark Antony's speech is commonly considered one of the greatest speeches in the history of the English language. And it is, because in order to manipulate the masses, you have to convince them, you have to persuade them. So that becomes another big theme of the play, is persuasion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, at every level down, there's the persuasion of, we start with the persuading of Brutus, and then with in the central pieces, you got the persuading of the masses that both Brutus and Antony are warring over. But there's also, the more you look at it, the more layers you'll find of it. There's even Caesar's persuasion, most obviously when Calpurnia is trying to convince him not to go, and she succeeds, and then he's easily overmastered. But also, what's happening in that rejecting of the crown, we don't see it directly. We have it told to us.
Yes.
And we have it told with a slant. And the slant that's put on it is, each time it's like he was more reluctant to reject it. There's a sense that he does want it. And we're meant to think, oh, is this a show? He's going to keep, I don't want it. Yes, finally, reluctantly, Romans, I will take up this. And so this persuasion, it goes all the way through the whole thing, so that this whole play becomes a drama about rhetoric.
Yes.
They're even at the end trying to persuade people to help them kill themselves.
That's right.
Yes. Right. Which suicide was, it's not a Christian virtue for sure, but it was a Roman one, right? Yeah. Even to sacrifice oneself to the Roman, to the city, right? To the civil life was considered, the greatest sacrifice of all. And Shakespeare, of course, was not a Roman, but he was, people debate his devotion, but he was firmly entrenched within a Christian society. So he's raising another complicated issue with suicide.
That's right. And the parallels between Rome and the British Empire at Shakespeare's time are not to be overlooked. I mean, this is an empire now. And if you look at Spenser, he refers to Queen Elizabeth as the Empress. Right. I mean, this is a standard moniker for her. And so it's an empire that has come about from a monarchy after a period where there was kind of, after this Republican period, and sort of reassertion of the rights of the people and whatnot. And so there's a lot of parallels in the history of late Rome, or Rome around the, pre-Augustan Rome, and what's happening in England. I think all of those things have to resonate with the original audience.
Right.
There's some stuff here about, this is just a line that I don't really have anything to say about it, but I just like it and I just want to get in there. Cassius has some really good lines, and I like this one. This is in Act 1, Scene 3. He says, "Nor stony tower, nor walls of beaten brass, nor airless dungeon, nor strong links of iron can be retentive to the strength of spirit." This is the type of thing that gets thrown into Shakespeare a lot. It's very similar to Polonius's advice to Laertes. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Be to thine own self be true, and it must follow as day as night, etc., etc. These characters keep saying these things in Shakespeare plays, and then the action of the play keeps proving that they're not exactly right about that. Right. And this is very much in line with the kind of the optimism that you're seeing as the age of exploration has broadened people's sense of the world, and this explosion of the Renaissance and everything has made people feel like we can do it, we can do more, we can do more. And Shakespeare puts those words in there, but they're always, the characters who say them usually end up dead by the end of the play.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I think that he gives Cassius so many wonderful lines, like the Fault in Our Stars line. There's so many. He's very stirring, and moving, and even ennobling in a way, right? And he says that directly to Casca, like, we have to get the noble Brutus on our side. And so in order to do that, he has to stir him to action, which is, again, a very Roman thing to do, right? Always action oriented. They pride themselves. We weren't like the Greeks that just sit around and talk about stuff. We're actually out there doing stuff, right? And so Cassius has these remarkable speeches that are so stirring to the soul, but you have to. And I think that goes to your point about that you made earlier, which was wonderful, that this is a play about rhetoric and the power of words to move the soul and to bring action, right? To catalyze real action, meaningful action in the world. And the play so often, especially in Acts 1 and 2 and 3, they bring up the question of that Socrates brings up about sophistry, right? Like, is it rhetoric enough? Or rhetoric has to serve virtue, or else it will serve vice. And then the second half of the play, Acts 4 and 5, kind of show us the crater that's created by the action that was stirred by rhetoric, and rhetoric cannot save them anymore. Acts 4 and 5, you don't get the stirring speeches. Some people don't even bother to read it because Caesar died in Act 3, right? Like there's war, but it's so, it lacks the stirring language of the first half of the play, which is not a flaw. That's purposeful on Shakespeare's fault, because in the second half of the play, no words can save them now. Like, rhetoric is now, we are past the point that rhetoric can bring back the dead. And rescue us from the plight that we have created.
That's good. So rhetoric cannot get you all the way to resurrection.
That's right. Oh, that's good.
Nice. Yeah. There's also, I was thinking about Caesar, and it's inevitable when you're talking about this play that you're thinking about history and the play together. And it's important to make distinctions at times. But I was just thinking, I was wondering, because in the history, in the timeline that we inhabit, what really justifies the focus on Caesar of later ages is the Act 4, Act 5, and Antony and Cleopatra stuff. It's everything that happens after his death. It is like you said, the crater that his death leaves in Roman culture, leading to the Roman Empire and everything that means going down the line. But I was asking myself, gosh, if they hadn't killed him, if he'd become king or whatever else, and they just sort of let that happen, would it actually have diminished his importance in history compared to what it is now? It's fascinating.
It sure is. I mean, obviously, there's no way to know. Either way, he was going to change the world, which I tell my students all the time. Like, there's very few people who actually change the world. There's people who impact the world, people who leave a legacy, people we still talk about, right? But there's a handful of people whose lives really actually changed the trajectory of history. And Julius Caesar is surely one of them, no matter what happened, because of, and not just because he was a remarkable person, he was, but because of the time and history that he inhabited, and what was going on with Rome at the time.
I do love that scene, speaking about words and how they can't be saved. I think it's scene 5 or Act 5, scene 1, where they have their parley before the battle. And it's kind of, you read it, you're like, well, why are we even doing this? Words before blows, they say. And it's like, well, what's the point?
Stop fighting! Stop fighting!
Nobody's going there to negotiate.
Part of the thing that was coming in my mind as well as you guys have been talking is it's fascinating that so much of this play about Caesar has got to do with rhetoric and the power of rhetoric to move things, because we're talking about a man who in part ascended to power through his literary abilities. Right? His war memoirs were very vastly important in doing exactly this work of swinging public opinion around to his side. And a lot of people talk about the Gallic War as being propaganda sent home to shore up his political position back home, right? And so it's even historically, it's built into him that rhetoric he's one of this great general, and yet rhetoric is so important to the way he negotiated the Rome of his time.
That's true. When I teach Julius Caesar in my classes, we're concurrently reading The Republic every time, and we always use him as an example of the education of the guardians, which is brought up in book 2, well, actually through the whole thing, but specifically there's a conversation between Socrates and Adeimantus when Socrates is telling him about the guardians, those who protect the boundaries of the city, and what kind of education should they receive in order to fortify them for this most noble of tasks, right? And it is to have an education that is spirited and philosophical, right? Educate their minds and their bodies, because only a unified soul can be worthy to protect the city. Now, I always use Caesar as an example of this and bring up the question, does it always work, right? Did it work with Caesar? He had both, right? What were the results of this education? He was a philosopher and a general. He was a remarkable man, a brilliant man, a genius. My favorite story about Caesar is him weeping at the age of 32 because he had not conquered the world. Alexander the Great had conquered the world by the time he was my age. What have I done with my life? I am a failure. But he raises so many questions, such a dividing line even now, because maybe Rome did need a strong leader. Maybe the Roman Republic experiment had failed. And
I think coming out of the Catilinarian conspiracy and Sulla before that, and the slave revolts, I mean, you gotta take that question seriously. You know what Caesar lacks in the guardian education? There's a key component that he didn't get, which is they're not supposed to even be able to be in the same house with gold or silver.
That's right. Yeah,
right? You got to keep them apart from all of that wealth and resources and things. And Caesar's got all that in spades.
Tempting for them.
Yeah.
Yep. But they're gonna the argument will be Brutus's argument. But he gave his money away to the Romans, like it was for the common people.
Yeah.
Right? He gave it all away. Wasn't attached to it at all.
Something that I did not realize I don't know. I just miss stuff sometimes. And I learned it recently and then saw that the reference was right here in the play as well. Where they killed him. They killed him in the first permanent theater in Rome, the first stone. They'd been illegal before they were still illegal when the theater was built. It was actually claimed that it was a temple instead of a theater, even though it had all the theater seats and everything in it. And it was built by Pompey. He gave the money for it, and it was called Pompey's Theater. And so they killed him in the theater of the guy whom he had just defeated for, as it were, sole control, sole influence over Rome. I don't know how I missed that when I was younger.
That's so great. I love it.
So I have a question. Act 4, you get this kind of interesting exchange between Cassius and Brutus, where their emotions towards each other clearly sour, but they have a kind of reconciliation. And of course, we find out why Brutus is in a bad mood. It's because his wife has died. But there's a kind of visceral antagonism directed at each other in that, and I'm wondering if it can purely be explained by Brutus and his personal situation, or if there might be something more to it. If there may be some sort of point about the nature of the conspiracy in which they have engaged, that while they put on a nice united front, if they had won the battle, which of course is a counterfactual, but if they had, I mean, would they have been able to stay together? It seems like the implication or the cratering that we were talking about earlier might include even their bond as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but this is something that really stuck out to me as I was reading that scene.
Oh, I really like that question. It makes me, it brings us back to the question of friendship, right? And you guys referenced ethics, in which Aristotle, which I don't know if that this would be have been on Shakespeare's mind, but this is a connection I'm making, right? When Aristotle says that there are those 3 levels of friendship, right? Like you meet a friend and you have something in common, you share a common interest. That's the first level. The second level is when you have a true affection for one another and want to know one another. For the first level, you love something together. The second, you love each other. And the third is you love the good. You both love the good. And that's the truest and highest form of friendship. And with that, you have all others. You have all other things. And Brutus and Cassius don't, right? The nature of their bond was based on division, not unity. And so of course it falls apart, because that's division is the natural moral consequence to a first break, right? If the break gets wider. And Brutus, I think, is more like he seems so astonished at this, right? Cassius turns on him, he turns on Cassius, and Brutus seems like he doesn't know what to do with that. Because he has convinced himself he was trying to do the right thing. Whereas Cassius' argument is basically like, I'm better than you, like, right? I'll not endure it. You forget yourself to hedge me in. Like, he's so accusatory, and Brutus is taken aback and then lashes out at him. And it's so characteristic of their two, of the two of them. They're psychologically compelling and consistent throughout the whole play.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, in a sense, the friendship between Brutus and Cassius masquerades as that third type of friendship, right? We're both concerned with the good and we love the good, but it's not that, because Cassius doesn't love the good. Cassius is, if we may not know about Brutus's ulterior motives, but I don't think there can be any doubt that Cassius has ulterior motives, right? And the clearest one we get in the play is, I don't like him being considered better than me, right? Where I have every much right as him. He's just a man like me. I don't like that he's above me, right? And so he's kind of a petty character in that sense. And so it looks like we've got this with this common love of the good. And then when you realize that's not the case, there's a kind of disenchantment on Brutus's part. That friendship was always impossible in a sense that Brutus was not aware of, because he bought Cassius's story at the beginning of the play.
Yeah, I wonder if for Brutus, I guess it goes back to how you assess the character. I mean, Cassius' sort of impropriety that is really what sets Brutus off in their conversation. It either bothers him because Brutus really does believe that he's acting towards the good, or it's a reminder that there is this nagging ulterior motive, and when Cassius actually indulges in this kind of impropriety, that it shines a light on the fact that maybe their motives were not as pure.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny because Brutus does the same sort of immovability thing in that moment as Cassius is wanted him to basically take a bribe. He does the same sort of immovability move, if you will, that Caesar made when they were asking about recalling the exiled relative, right? He's like, nope, Caesar stands by justice. Caesar will never not do what's right. Caesar's a fixed star, right? And then they kill him. And that sort of gives them this pretext. And that's also we haven't even talked about that yet. That's one of the deepest ambiguities in the play, is after all this talk about the good of Rome, the actual moment of the assassination is focused on recall this exiled person, right? Bring him back, pardon him. And so it muddies the sense of what are we actually doing here in this assassination, right? It's not clear because you're getting a different message at the moment of the assassination than what we had before. And then that gets echoed later with Brutus and Cassius, where the roles are reversed. And Brutus, there's an argument, if you want one, for Brutus being a true lover of Caesar, is that Brutus is actually an imitator of Caesar.
Yeah, I think he definitely considers himself a true lover of Caesar, and he seems to have a true affection for him, and a real personal bond that amongst leaders is rare, especially as we see the other characters, Cassius, Cascus, and like that don't have that.
Yeah.
And the bond between Caesar and Brutus is real, and it's affectionate. And so on the one hand, right, point counterpoint, like on the one hand, how much honor, how much love must Brutus have for his country to be willing to sacrifice his friend? This was the move of a true patriot, right? Or on the other hand, like, what the world's worst friend ever, right? For such a small thing.
Yeah.
Right. That didn't have to happen that way. There's no dire crisis, right? This is a preemptive strike, and that's very important to the play.
Yeah. And so there's that on the one hand. I mean, so this brings us to the single most famous line in the play, and to Dante, right? Et tu, Brute, then falls Caesar, right? If Brutus is also stabbing me, then what's the point in fighting to live anymore, right? And you almost get the feeling from that line that it's Brutus's betrayal more than Brutus's blade that does Caesar in, right? And Dante takes that and throws Brutus right in Satan's mouth.
So Junius, tell us where Brutus is in the pit of hell. And
Brutus has the honor, right, of being Brutus and Judas are two of the three sinners, the three traitors, being chewed by Satan in his mouth in the bottom pit of hell. No one is further down in hell than them except for Satan himself. And they get personal Satan torment in hell. I mean, it's as bad a sentence as you can get.
Right. The pit of the betrayals, like to betray country and friend is the worst sin.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare does Brutus, I think, quite an honor to make him a tragic character rather than a villain. It was a bold move on his part. And he knew his Dante. And he gives us a softer Brutus, a more ambiguous Brutus, a Brutus whose motives are ambivalent. He doesn't seem to be trying necessarily to just redeem him. Like, this isn't like a modern, villain backstory that but he honors his humanity and presents a Brutus that we can relate to, so much so that most people read this play and find him to be the hero.
Yes, which is very strange to me. Like, I found that people tend to be pro Brutus rather than pro Caesar if you ask them about it. And to me, that was always very strange. Even though my name is Junius and not Julius. which people often get wrong.
I'm sure they do.
We'll
Yeah.
start calling you Junius Caesar.
Just don't get Caesared. You
That's
don't want
right.
that.
That's right.
No,
That's
no,
right.
thank
You better
you.
be careful.
I'd like to see
Yeah.
my kids grow up, if you don't mind.
Right.
Well, it does raise a question, though. So, obviously, in the Roman mind, there's this civic ideal that we have to all strive for. And this has a way of making everything political.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're in a world in which perhaps our focus on virtue is not quite there, but we do have a cultural fixation of making everything political.
Mm-hmm.
You often hear that everything is political.
Yeah.
In a world where everything is political, is friendship really possible?
Mm.
Because, of course, Brutus has to eventually sacrifice the friendship for the greater good.
The greater good.
And you see this today, right? People are willing to sacrifice friendships for their sort of political ideals often.
Yep.
Maybe
Yep.
they'll block someone on Facebook, or they won't talk to that relative, or they don't want to go to family Thanksgiving because crazy uncle so-and-so is going to start talking about whatever, right? So it's interesting. And I don't know really what the solution is in this context, but it does raise the question.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle's kind of given us a way out, right? Because if is true friendship possible when everything's political, what is the good, right? Because if you can both love the good, then you can be friends. And so the problem is that if you make everything political and you really mean that, then what you're going to do is you're going to take that high ideal of the good that Plato had and that Aristotle to a serious extent shares, and you're going to domesticate it. You're going to now invest that in the political entity, the political body. And that is not a good that is high enough to ground real friendship, right? At best, because the political body itself is a transient, ad hoc approximation of something or other, at best, that's going to lower friendship to the level of mutual interest.
Which was Rousseau, right? When we did
Right.
Social Contract.
Yeah, exactly right. And so the question is, can you, only if you can find a good that transcends the political order, could you hope for friendships that are able to survive political difference?
So this exact question, I really love this question, Father Wesley, because this is why I love Shakespeare so much and why I love the history plays so much, because they take on these big political questions. But Shakespeare never lets anything remain political. It's always human. It's always embodied. And it's always motivated by something human, right? Becomes in Shakespeare a question of virtue and vice, for sure, and a question of relationships, right? I think about the English history plays are full of these. Like, you never forget in Henry IV, Part 1, that we're not just talking about about Prince Hal as a political figure, but as a young man torn between his friend and his father.
Yes.
Right? And Richard II, it's Bolingbroke, his cousin, that he exiles, and his uncle that he watches die callously and then steals his money. Like, they are political moves, but they're also so human, and relationally and communally embedded, and that is far more true than the isolation of political forces, qua political forces, right? And that's why I love Shakespeare so much, and why I particularly love the history plays. Is a very political play.
Yeah.
But it is also always a human play, always. And for Shakespeare, politics is human, and I think we should have that more. We should be reading Shakespeare more and remembering that more in these ideological conflicts and divides of our age.
Well, and what I love about the history plays as well is that they're all tragedies.
That's right.
and so then that draws a line to the greatest of the tragedies. In most people's opinion, not mine, King Lear. I'm a Hamlet guy, but in King Lear, it's another top example of what you're saying right here. It's daughters, and this family drama between fathers and daughters that's played out over the politics of dividing the kingdom, and which has never really worked out in all of Western history. But that same drama played out again, and so there's this sense of, oh gosh, okay, so we're going to draw history. We're not going to take sides. we're going to get really psychological and human about it. And it keeps ending up in tragedy. Even Henry V, which has the happiest ending you could hope for in a play like that, it ends with a remark that Henry VI is going to lose everything that Henry V gained, right? He lost the kingdom. And so there's this, I don't want to call it a pessimism about history because I don't think that's right. But I think there's a soberness about it that you see in the histories that turns them in that direction a lot, because you can't, if you're going to get involved, I use the phrase, if you're going to get involved in the Game of Thrones, right, then there's the amount of collateral damage you're going to have to be okay with if you're going to have a chance at coming out on top of it. It needs to raise deep and urgent human questions.
That Shakespeare's continually raising. And Father Wesley, to your point about friendship, one of the questions in this place is friendship, right? What is it? What does it look like to be a friend and a statesman? Is it possible, right? And this is another question that Shakespeare's preoccupied with in his tragedies and in his history plays is it possible for a great leader to be a good man? And vice versa. I mean, Henry VI, I mean, his Henry VI plays, which are, decent plays, but not, not Shakespeare, they're Shakespeare, but not Shakespeare, you know what I mean? But he gives us a good man who's a terrible king.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have other plays in which there is a great king who's not a good man. Right. And in this play, we have a lot of both, right? And I think that that question becomes centered on Caesar himself, but that's even more of a political question. It really is more about Brutus. Is Brutus? He's obviously trying, or at least telling himself he's a good man, but is his failure? Is it a moral failure? Because the play seems to say the assassination was a failure. It shouldn't have happened, right? I think that the play is pretty definitive on that within the world of the play. That it has terrible consequences. But the question for me seems to be with Brutus is his failure a moral failure, or is it a strategic failure? Like, did it fail because he just wasn't thinking right and made the wrong strategic decision, or did it fail because it was a moral, he shouldn't have done it in a moral sense? And I think the play leaves that a bit ambiguous, which I like. It raises questions.
Yeah, and that brings us to the last character we ought to have talked about. We need to talk about, which is Mark Antony. And it reminds me of, there's this, with Cicero, not Caesar. Cicero was asked once when Octavius was coming up. Someone said, "What do you think about this young kid Octavius?" To which Cicero responded, "Susque deque," which is Latin for, take it or leave it. He doesn't matter, right? He won't amount to anything. He's not important. And then, of course, Octavius ordered Cicero's death. And it's just kind of the same thing here with Brutus and Antony, right? Cassius is trying to tell him, Antony is an appendage of Caesar. If you kill Caesar and don't get him, it's that moment in Macbeth, right? If you don't get don't get both the sons, then you're creating a problem for later on. And Brutus is like, no, Antony's fine. You know what? Let's talk to him, and we can bring him around, and it's gonna be cool.
He's cool.
Yeah, he'll get it, right? He's cool. He's down. And then you see Antony in this crazy position of, in the moment of his grief, when he finds out, he's immediately in danger. And so this is the other great friend in the play. And this is the friend who looks traditionally like a friend because he avenges the death of his friend, right? And he has got to pretend to go along with these guys to play it out long enough to see what's possible. And it's really not clear, even coming into his speech. His intention is, I got to sound out the people. And if the people are on Brutus's side, then I can't do anything. Like, I'm going to have to get out of here, right? But if they are, well, just maybe something is possible. I like the idea. He's like, I've got Caesar's will right here. I don't dare read it out to you. Oh, read it. What if, he just walks around carrying Caesar's will with him? Is that what we're thinking, right? Or is he just pulling a piece of paper out?
He found it in his closet.
Exactly right. You haven't been anywhere, dude. Like, seriously. And I love that moment for me, those first moments of danger for Mark Antony, when he's got to try to figure out how to negotiate that. It speaks well to how good a politician he is. Yeah. But also, to me, it also raises those questions of friendship. Does he have to betray his friendship for a while in order to reach a place where he can actually act out of that friendship.
Right. It's Mark Antony's such an interesting character here, because he's by far the greatest rhetorician on the stage, like by a mile. I mean, so much so, like his speech about when he points out all of the holes in Caesar's garment where Caesar has been stabbed. That's like not even famous, and it's so good. It's so good. It's brilliant. But then, I mean, it gets overshadowed by his other speech, right? His friend's Roman countrymen speech. But which Shakespeare, like, how did Shakespeare even happen? Like, how did that guy? He's so good, but. Like your point about Mark Antony is really compelling, especially because he continues in the next play when he totally derails on a strategic level. And Antony and Cleopatra, because he seems to me to be a man with this considerable ability, but is entirely led by his appetites, right? He ends up being a man of the belly, but a man of the belly with a golden tongue, which seems super dangerous to me. And we see that played out on stage.
I was just going to grab this quote from Antony and Cleopatra about that. No, I'm sorry. Actually, it's from Troilus in Cassandra, isn't it? It is. That's right. Where Nestor says it. So this is Ulysses says this. So this is Odysseus speaking, but this I think describes Mark Antony really well. He says, let me see where to start this. If you don't respect age and crowns and scepters and everything, right? What happens? Take what degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless jar justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power. Power unto will, will into appetite, and appetite and universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce and universal prey, and last eats up himself.
That's good.
Right? I mean, you have that when you're led by appetite, ultimately, this is the Christian doctrine of sin. When you're led by appetite, the thing you succeed in destroying is yourself.
Yep. And in this case, the entire Roman way of life.
Yeah.
Also yep, the city is like the soul is like the city, like, because these men are so led by their greed, by their lust, right? Like they're led by their bellies, and it causes the downfall of an entire civilization or a way of life, and a transition into a decadent and declining way of life later on. And so that is, that's the tragedy of Julius Caesar.
Yeah, that's a steep warning for us today as well.
Amen.
Well, were there any other topics that you feel like we need to cover here?
I wanted to just touch on the conflict throughout the whole play, having to do with signs and visions and portents, right? That this whole idea of fate versus free will, like what is brought about by the hand of man and what by the hand of the gods, is a major concern in all pagan writing, for sure. Whether it's Greek or Roman, or any other, right? That whole idea of fate versus free will is haunting to the Greek and Roman writers. And Shakespeare seems to bring it up here too. It's a major concern of the play. Is it because of the portents? And what happens if we defy them, right? And that's another concern that happens in Macbeth, which I know you just
defy augury.
Yes. Like what but the gods seem to be speaking through the skies to these people, and everything that the portend happen, but the people ignore them, right? So what is brought about by the hand of man? How much power do we have over our fates, and the fate of nations? Like, what is it that free will can do, for evil as well as for good?
Thank you for bringing that up, because that was the one thing the one note that I had left that we hadn't touched. And I'll just add a couple of things and then read a passage. That concern continues in medieval Christianity. And so you have, Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy is asking that question, and he gives us this synthesis of saying that, well, what people call fate here is divine providence looked at from the wrong side, like looked at from the bottom up. And so that kind of resolves the thing. What that has the effect of giving a lot of folks in the Middle Ages permission to continue with a sort of astrological determinism that Boethius would be as against as the Book of James is. That's what the beginning of the Book of James is about. If you look at that passage in Greek about the, with whom there's no shadow of change, every word in that passage is a term used in Greek for astrology. Talking about the stars and conjunctions and waning and all this other kind of thing. And he's trying to say that unlike Venus and these other gods whose power is greater or less depending on where their planet is in the heaven, our God isn't like that. His power is constant all the way through. And so, as late as Chaucer, this is still a major discussion. And it's an issue in the Knight's Tale and the Canterbury Tales, where the issue of the thing seems to be determined by the stars. And of course, Chaucer translated the Consolation of Philosophy into Middle English. And so he was very familiar with that Boethius material. And then Chaucer's the greatest poet that Shakespeare's got to deal with in his language before he comes up, right? So there's a nice unbroken line there from the ancient world through the medievals to the Renaissance. Second thing is, within the Renaissance worldview, and this also is kind of a continuation of the medieval worldview, there's this sense that it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that God or the gods are trying to say something by the portents, so much as if great things are going to happen, it's impossible that they not be reflected in the stars, and it's impossible that they not be accompanied by these other sorts of things. Octavius is shocked in Antony and Cleopatra when he finds out that Antony is dead, because there should have been some signs or something, right? There should have been a greater crack. And so it's even if it's not about determinacy, there is the question of correspondence, which makes it foolish to ignore portents, because what's happening on Earth is a microcosm of what's happening in the greater cosmos. So the passage is in Act 2, Scene 2, starting in line 27. Caesar says, "What can be avoided whose end is purposed by the mighty gods? Yet Caesar shall go forth, for these predictions are to the world in general, as to Caesar," right? This is talking about bad things are going to happen, generally speaking. It's not specifically about me. He doesn't know what kind of story he's in. It's a story that's going to be titled by him. Things happening to the world in general are the things that happen to him. He is the defining great genius in Hegel's sense of this age. And so, yes, Caesar, those things are about you.
That's good. I didn't know that about the Book of James.
Yeah.
That is so cool.
It's super cool.
I love that. I'm going to go look that up immediately.
That's one of those things about, by talking about it in terms of philosophical theology and sort of immutability of God and stuff, we miss that the proximate context was pagan theology.
So good. Glory to God for all things.
Amen.
Would it be, it seems germane to the point that you're making, that is there a philosophical subtext going on with Brutus and Cassius and perhaps Caesar too? Because doesn't Cassius talk about being an Epicurean at one point? I think that I feel I should have made a more careful note about this. Maybe this isn't the right fodder for conversation, but it does seem to come up. But Caesar seems very detached. He seems to sort of be an ideal Stoic in that line. But Cassius is kind of.
He does refer to his luxuries. I'm sure you're right. I just don't know where the reference is, but
I think it's towards the end. But yeah.
You're right. He is the Epicurean of the play, and then
he does say that. Yeah, that I held Epicurus strong in his opinion.
Yep.
And then you have the Stoics, right? And he highlights Shakespeare's highlights the inconsistencies and the holes within these two kind of ways of being that were very Roman, right? Or at least very influential to the Romans, and their Stoic virtues. Like, they held so high these Stoic virtues. You mentioned at the top of the podcast, I'm writing a book on duty and desire, and I talk a lot about the Romans in there because the Romans have this elevation of duty, but they have, and then the Epicureans, of course, had this idolatry of desire. But where's the unity, right? And the Romans just praised this whole idea of self-denial for the sake of the civic good. Piety to them was a civic virtue, not a religious one. And the original, Roman story of the Aeneid denies our hero Aeneas any kind of meaningful fulfillment of desire. He always has to sacrifice everything that he wants for the sake of Rome, and he's held up as this paragon of Roman virtues. And Shakespeare kind of takes that to this extreme, particularly with Brutus, who does truly seem to want to do his duty, and is so easily deceived as to what that duty is. And has no meaningful kind of plumb line for anything that will actually nourish his soul, like a long-term friendship with someone he's willing to kill.
Right.
And his wife, right? Like his inability to truly grieve for his wife, whom he seems to love, and she's kind of awesome, right? Like that. There's Brutus is he wants to do the right thing, and he is a tragic character, but his tragedy is that he commits this, the worst of Christian sins, and has convinced himself that he's doing the right thing. And I think that has very, very relevant parallels to our political situation right now.
Yeah.
And the story that we tell ourselves of what we're willing to sacrifice for some kind of civic virtue that ends up being a vice. Right?
Yeah. I think that's right. Does the play mention why Portia dies? Or how, she dies? I don't think it does. I think it's just Portia's dead, and then the news comes that she's dead.
Right.
I wonder if, because they were going to Brutus's house, the mob was. I wonder if she's a casualty of his choice as well.
No, she commits suicide.
Oh,
she burns. Yeah, she swallows hot coals.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, that burn her from the inside, right?
Oh,
because she's an ideal Roman wife, right?
There's a metaphor for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
But that gets glossed over in the play. There's so many people dying right and left, right? How are you supposed to keep track?
Yep. Well, that's Rome for you. That'll drive your life expectancy down.
Well, have we maybe reached a point where we can do our end notes?
Yeah, we've scratched the surface enough, right?
Yeah. So Heidi, is our esteemed guest. We'll let you go first. What is your end note?
So the end note is some kind of work of art or something that we would point to that's based on this play. Is that right?
Or that would help readers better understand it, or something. Yeah, anything.
I have a definitive one. I knew right away when Junius texted me about this. It's a film from 2012 called Caesar Must Die. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's a remarkable film. It's an Italian film. And it came out, like I said, in 2012, and it was made by these brothers, the Taviani brothers. So the film is set in a prison, and it follows convicts and their rehearsals of a prison performance of Julius Caesar. It's unbelievable. So it shows them auditioning, and it tells you the stories of these convicts who are going to put on the play, and they're lifers, right? They're there. They are, and most of them are there because of murders, or organized crime or drug trafficking. And so they're putting on this play, which is, and it's a real story. These are real convicts in a real prison, in real life. And it shows the performance and then their rehearsals and how they do it in a prison. And this prison is just this like metaphorical Rome, right? And the characters, or the actors just like throw themselves into this performance and like find themselves. It shows them like weeping during rehearsals and negotiating with each other in their own personal relationships as they work these things out in performing the play. It's really, really good. Subtitled, so it takes a little bit of work to watch, but it's worth it.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah,
Love
it's
it.
super cool.
Junius, what's yours?
So mine is J.M. Barrie's play Dear Brutus, which is that's a reference to that line, "The fault in our stars, in our stars is not in our stars but in ourselves." It's really, and it's in many ways it's a better end note to Midsummer Night's Dream, but I don't know when we're going to do that, so I'm going to use it now. It is. There've been a few books that have just blown me away in the last few years, and this was one of them. And it's got that same, Barrie shows himself to be a worthy successor of Shakespeare in all the ways that Heidi's talking about, because it's so psychologically. I mean, I felt myself deeply convicted and weeping during it, and it's heartbreaking moments, and yet it's also funny and delightful, and so you can see both, the author of Peter Pan, but also someone who is a much more serious writer there. And so, Dear Brutus by J.M. Barrie, really delightful and powerful play that I recommend.
I'd never read it, and I picked up a copy when you told me you were going to be doing this on your EndNote. So I haven't opened it yet, but I'm really excited to read it. So thank you.
Break tissues.
Yeah. All right.
I got really nervous, Heidi, when you said yours was a movie and that it was from 2012, because I thought we maybe picked the same thing, but we didn't. I picked Ides of March, which was a movie with George Clooney and Ryan Gosling and Philip Seymour Hoffman, and it transposes the Shakespeare story into kind of modern American politics. I believe it's based on a stage play as well called Farragut North, that was then adapted into a movie. But I think it's interesting because we've talked so much about the political context of the work, and in both Caesar's day and also in Shakespeare's day. And so perhaps the Ides of March would be a good way to contextualize the story to our particular political context today. So
cool.
Excellent. Well, Heidi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been really lovely.
Are you kidding? This is so much fun. Thanks for including me.
Absolutely.
Well, we will have to have you on again at some point. Maybe sometime when your book is about to come out, we could have you again.
Love that.
Excellent. Well, listeners, our next work will be Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. And so we'll see you next month. In the meantime, keep reading.